It'll say good day to you this day of your time. How are you all? All right. All right. Thank you. Once again, we thank each and every one of you and all of you together collectively for the co-creation of this interaction. Let us begin this transmission with the title, The Last Days of Atlantis. The reason we are delivering this at this time is because your transition from your October to November month is the anniversary of its destruction. This is why, even though it has turned into something else, turned into a different translation, this is, however, the original reason why you have All Hallows Eve, Halloween, and the idea of All Souls Day and All Saints Day, October 31st, November 1st, November 2nd. The day before the destruction, the day of the destruction, the day after the destruction of Atlantis. That is the original reason for those holy days, in remembrance of that. So let us go back in time, approximately 12,800 of your years ago, or what you typically refer to as 10,800 BC. This was approaching the end of the days of the Atlantis civilization that had existed for many thousands of years. Began when there was the migration of those indigenous peoples in what you call your North and South America, the migration across the continents from west to east, eventually creating the colony of Atlantis in the islands that you now recognize to some degree as the Bahamas and Cuba. Although remember that in those days there was great ice shelves coming down from the north, covering a great portion of North America, and the oceans, having that much water locked into ice, were much lower at the time, somewhere between 250 to 300 feet lower. Thus, revealing, if you even look at your ocean maps today, the outline of the islands as they used to be. The Bahamas now are simply the remnants of what used to be the main island, along with Cuba, of the Atlantean civilization, though they did, of course, spread into North, Central, and South America, and even cross the oceans into what you know as Europe in the Mediterranean and Northern and Western Africa. But even though their so-called empire was vast, the main islands were off the coast now of what you call your North and Central and South America. And many people on your planet at this time, because much of the history was lost, and because most of what you still remember of the idea of Atlantis came through ancient stories from Egypt that were passed along to individuals in Greece and then shared with your modern individuals, you tend to imagine, because these stories came from Greece, that Atlantis had something similar to Grecian architecture. It did not. The closest representation that you have of Atlantean architecture is Aztecan architecture. Large stone blocks, the kind of pyramids that you find in Central and South America. These are the appearances of the kind of structures you would have seen in Atlantean times. And the Aztec architecture that remains is the closest remnant to the idea of Atlantean architecture that still exists on your planet. Now, it did change a little bit when they went over into the idea of the Mediterranean, but it didn't become Grecian architecture. The closest representation is that which you call the Minoan architectures, specifically the Temple of Knossos on the island of Crete. You will see there an ancient Atlantean colony in that temple, which is known as the Labyrinth Temple and the legend of the Minotaur, for the Atlanteans were bull worshippers. So the idea is that they adopted some of the Grecian architecture, but still retained something quite different. For if you look at the architecture of the Temple of Knossos, you will find that the pillars and the structures there are not what you would find in the area you know to be Greece. They are painted differently, they are shaped differently. And it represents more the idea of the Atlantean idea of decoration, being that the pillars are red and black and the stones are white. And if you look at the remnants of the labyrinth that exists in the Temple of Knossos on the island of Crete, you will see that it was actually an initiation labyrinth which came from the culture of Atlantis. For when you follow the traces that remain of the labyrinth that are dug into the ground and lined with stone, you will find at the end of every single turn a large crystal buried in the rocks of the labyrinth. So that at each station there was an opportunity to meditate on those crystals, to resonate with those crystals, and work your way through the labyrinth in the sense of a particular ritual that will allow you at the end to allow your mind to open up to new understandings, new information, new initiations of the cosmos. This came from ancient Atlantean times. Now, in the days before the destruction, which actually covered a very large span of time, for there was a, shall we say, very large master comet that came into your solar system and took up an orbit, an eccentric orbit, that crossed the path of Earth's orbit twice every year. And for a period of time, rained down upon the Earth, as the comet broke up, various remnants that would impact your Earth and cause great destruction. These cometary fragments, twice a year, bombarded the North American and Atlantic region for a period of over 2 decades. Every year, twice a year. The obliteration was almost complete of anything that existed in those areas over that span of time, which is one of the reasons why you very, very, very much don't see almost anything left of whatever was in those areas. Imagine being bombarded for over 20 years by cometary impacts in your city. There wouldn't be much left. But it started relatively small, and mostly bombarded the ice shelves and the eastern seaboard of the Americas, many chunks falling into the Atlantic Ocean, causing tsunamis. But there was at one point a greater chunk that came through the atmosphere, the primary body of the comet, that finally penetrated the atmosphere and struck in the Atlantic Ocean, gouging out a crater in the ocean floor, and caused massive tsunamis in all directions, radiating out from the Atlantic, tsunamis at least 300 feet high. This is the obliteration, the final obliteration of the idea of Atlantis, cultures on the eastern seaboards of North, Central, and South America, tsunamis that struck the western seaboards of Europe and Africa and into the Mediterranean. And this is the beginning of your legendary flood of Noah. The idea also is that in those ancient times before the final destruction, since there were many cometary impacts and since they could observe the master comet arcing through the sky before it ever hit, they understood by plotting its trajectory, and especially after some of the fragments began to impact the Earth, that their time was running out. Many of them fled into other areas to preserve their culture, their knowledge, their civilization, going into South America, going into some parts of Central America, going into parts of Africa, parts of Europe, and all the way into the beginnings of the culture that became Egypt, bringing their knowledge, bringing their technology, their architecture into the understanding of what it took to build the great pyramids in Egypt. But before that time, again, in observing this master comet, which still to this day provides what you call meteor showers at certain times of the year, including the time that is coming up now. That was the time of the destruction of Atlantis in its final days. You still find what you call the toroid meteor showers are the remnants of that comet still to this day shooting through your skies. But now, simply the remains are very small and burn up in your atmosphere rather quickly, providing you with a spectacular show, but still acting as a reminder of those days, back when the sign of a comet in the sky and the memory, the civilization's collective consciousness memory of that comet is one of the reasons why comets developed the reputations that they did of being bad omens of destruction. It comes specifically from that comet that destroyed Atlantis. Now, also at that time, the idea, even though the concept of dragons is also something else, also interdimensional beings that present themselves to you in your reality in a certain way that you have called a dragon form, comets also in ancient times were referred to as dragons, for they crossed the sky with their glorious burning tails, and again were akin to the idea of the interdimensional dragons in how they appeared against the stars. So you can see that many different kinds of ideas, many different legends about comets and other things developed from this one experience that began an age upon your Earth that your scientists recognize and have labeled the Younger Dryas period. This shifted your climate radically at that time. And the cometary impacts that impacted the thick ice shelves on the North American continents caused much flooding, much runoff. And that spilled into the oceans over time, raising the ocean levels so that today you find they are 250 to 300 feet higher than they were at that time, submerging most of the Atlantean islands that existed in the Atlantic Ocean. And again, one of the main reasons why you find it so challenging to find any remnants of that civilization today, although some things do still exist in those areas that you have yet to discover. But let us look at those last days and bring into your imagination the idea of a thriving civilization of beauty, of great pyramidal structures, of great paved streets, of stone and temples, painted red, white, black, and sometimes sheathed in gold and silver, and the combination alloy that was known as orichalcum, which contained also copper and mixes of gold and silver in various proportions. And the idea of the beautiful, shining crystals that gave light and power to the ancient capital cities of the ancient Atlantean Empire, and that also could be used in understanding their vibration for long-distance communication between the main empire islands and the outposts that existed around the planet. The idea then is to imagine, in those days, the beautiful brown-skinned people walking on those streets and floating above those streets in lighter-than-air balloons, and understanding the idea of the stars and having astronomy and a great understanding of mathematics and a deep understanding of the earth and nature and their part in it, that over time, over eons, became split into those that retained the ancient ways of connection to the earth and those that began to slide down into the idea of fear-based beliefs and the corruption of the concept of the illusion of power. Your psychic, Edgar Cayce, referred to these as the children of light and the children of darkness. For there was this split in Atlantis, as such a split is now even beginning to accelerate in your time. For the idea itself of the Americas is a recounting and a recycling of the idea of Atlantean times, and an opportunity for you to lift yourselves up into a different future and a different path and a different outcome than what it is that they themselves experienced. For they knew they had reached the end of their cycle. And so many of those that understood their connection to the earth, their connection to the stars, began to migrate away from the Atlantean capitals into various parts of the world that they knew would be safe, where they could rebuild, where they could preserve their knowledge in ancient structures such as some of the ancient pyramids, preserve their libraries in Alexandria and in Giza under the Sphinx, and in certain areas of Yucatan and South America and Peru, where some of those libraries still exist today and have yet to be discovered. That would reveal much about the Atlantean times. But thinking back again to those days and knowing that these beings were recognizing that they were coming to the end of a cycle and leaving in great ships, there were those simply that did not believe and did not take heed and perished in the destruction. For some of them, while they were corrupt, some of them simply could not bear to leave their homeland and knew through their learning and their knowledge, through their understanding of their connection to nature, that there would be an opportunity once again in what you call their future, in what you call your present, for them to live out through the idea of reincarnational experiences, those cycles once again, and to look to the light and bring the light with them that would allow for a different, a more positive, a more constructive, a more peaceful, beautiful, and artistically creative outcome, so that in a sense, even though the island itself has sunk, Atlantis may arise again in a new form, in the same basic continent that they had crossed, migrated across to create the colony of Atlantis, the empire of Atlantis, so that it may rise again in the Americas one day. Listen to the knowledge that was preserved of the indigenous tribes of South, Central, and North America, for they contain the information and the knowledge of the rising of Atlantis once more. Allow yourselves to imagine yourselves again connected to those times and walking those streets as the indigenous population that knew the stars and knew the earth in deep ways that you have yet yourselves to experience again, except for perhaps a few of those indigenous tribes that remain on your planet that have kept to the old ways, the ancient ways of knowledge, and know that the cycle has now begun anew, and that you are in those times, not only the end times, but the beginning times, that allow you once again to experience the glory, the beauty, and the grace, gratitude, and appreciation that was paramount in the highest days of the Atlantean civilization. And they did interact with many forms of natural life, in particular, communicating with the dolphins and the whales, many of which were allowed into the temples through great channels, through great ideas of canals, which allowed them to swim right into the center of the pools in many of the temples in Atlantis, so that they could commune together and build the idea of a society of land and sea, and had much knowledge of the idea of the herbs of nature and the foods of nature that would promote healing, and the vibrations that would promote the idea of stability and healing and beauty and health and wealth in the connection to nature that they experienced in those days. Allow yourselves to feel within your own being once again that connection to nature. Let at first, before it appears within the actual physical reality, let at first that feeling, that knowledge, that rising of Atlantis to begin within you, within your spirit and within your soul. and allow it to penetrate deeply within your hearts, and feel the drum beat in your heart that was utilized in Atlantis as a teaching mechanism. For when the drums of Atlantis matched the heartbeat, then they could, through induction, slow down the drum beats and allow your hearts to slow down into a meditative, hypnotic state in which all lessons were given and all lessons were retained, because they were allowed to go into the state in which all information that was given was absorbed easily and effortlessly and retained throughout their lifetimes. The drums of Atlantis are the key to the states of being that will allow Atlantis to rise once again from your hearts, from your souls, from your spirits, and from your bodies, so that it may once again one day begin to appear upon the land that you know as the Americas. It can then spread once again into the lands around the earth, recalling and reconnecting to those Atlantean colonies in Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, and all the way back to their history and their legacy that came all the way from Lemuria in Southeast Asia before they crossed the land bridges of the north and the oceans of the south to arrive in the Americas, north, central, and south, and begin their migrations across the continents to create the shining civilization eventually that was Atlantis, which will awaken again, as we say, first in your hearts, in your souls, your spirits, your minds, and your bodies, and finally to physically manifest once again as Earth continues in its evolution of becoming the sixth hybrid race, inviting the ancient connections and families of extraterrestrials that were known in Atlantean times to once again rejoice and celebrate with you on the surface of your world.
Hello, my friend. How are you doing?
Perfect. And you?
Wonderful.
All right.
I had a question about Atlantean stuff,
Yes,
such
Atlantean
as
stuff.
the Atlantean
There's
hypnosis.
a big box of Atlantean stuff.
Let's open the lid.
Yes.
Let's do it.
All right. What would you like to know?
So you often talk about Atlantean hypnosis technologies and the drum technologies.
Yes.
And what kind of skin did they make their drums out of in those days, and what proportions and whatnot?
It is more literally the idea of hollowed out logs, not skins.
Logs. Can you elaborate on that, please?
You don't know what a log is?
I do know what a log is, Bashar. So hollowed out logs, but like, what do you mean? What like, would they tap it with their hands or?
No, they could tap with sticks. You know what a stick is, right?
Stick. How would you say stick in Atlantean, Bashar?
That vocabulary is not within the channel's mind, where there's no translation for us.
So there's no like syntax we could open up for Atlantean language, like Tai Chi or community. Any beautiful words like that? Maybe?
Again, the words, the vocabulary has to be in the channel's mind for there to be a translation on this end, and for us to translate through to you. There has to be something that represents it. The closest thing at this point that represents it is the word stick.
Awesome. And so with sticks and a hollowed out log, and would that be in a temple of certain proportions?
Yes, it often could be. It doesn't have to be, but it could be.
Okay, so it could also be done in nature outside?
Absolutely.
Okay, and so I'm really into this idea, the science of the obvious, and making things really evident, where we as humans plummeted ourselves in this idea of limitation and separation, where we make the most simple of ideas most complex.
Yes. Now, watch, because don't automatically assume that limitation is negative.
No, not at all.
All right.
Yeah, I love exploring limitations.
All right.
So
The idea is, of course, you are imposing limitations on yourself to even have a physical experience.
yes,
Therefore, you're using it in a positive way.
yes. So we must have some kind of resistance for some kind of existence.
No,
No?
no.
Okay.
It's simply something that you've chosen to do because it's an exciting experience that will allow you to discover something new about yourself from a different perspective. Therefore, you had to impose certain limitations on your self-awareness in order to have a limited experience that would give you a new perspective. But that's a very positive thing if done that way. That's all we're saying is don't automatically assume the word in your language limitation is automatically a negative thing or a negative experience.
Not at all.
All right.
Yeah, because
So back to your sticks.
yeah, back to the sticks. So the idea of getting in this hypnotic journey
Yes.
with the drums
Yes.
is that's kind of basic of what we're doing today. There's nothing special that they were doing different.
Well, only in the sense that they understood specifically that they had to match the person's heartbeat first
Yes.
so that there would be a synchronization, and then they would start to slow the drum beat down very slowly, very imperceptibly almost, until the person fell into the hypnotic state by their heart following the drum beat once they were entrained to match its frequency.
So that's a two-way conjunction.
Yes,
Yes.
it's a dialogue of rhythms, of vibrations.
And beautiful. And through that soothed state brings on the hypnotic journey.
Yes.
So our idea of hypnosis is akin to theirs, or is there
It's
some
similar.
specific structures that might be different? That might
Well,
be a
it's-
big
it's
leverage
similar.
difference.
They would then create certain kinds of information using certain vibrational words and tones, maybe even sometimes in song, to impart the information. But mostly what they would do would be to tell story, because they understood that story structure is embedded in your psyche. And therefore, by telling information in the form of a story, it is more easily retained, especially from the hypnotic state. It can actually unlock you from one perspective of reality into a completely different perspective of reality if done with artistry, which they did.
Beautiful.
So in other words, they allowed through story and the drum beats and the hypnotic state, perhaps in teaching, let's say, for example, someone about the idea of sailing ships, you would become the sail. You would become the mast. You would experience the wind in the hypnotic state. By the time you came out of it, you would innately in your body understand exactly what to do to operate a sailing ship, because you would have been one in your experience in the way they induced the story through your story structure psyche. You would have been on a voyage as a sailing ship, not only as a sailor, but as the ship, as the wind, as the sea, as the gulls, as the entire experience. It would be literally in your bones by the time you came out of it.
Wow, that is deep.
It is.
And that's
That
part.
didn't necessarily happen in one session.
Yes.
Don't
okay.
misunderstand.
Okay.
But the artistry was to entrain in a way that it was simply infused within the cells of the person in a very, very natural way, so that they just really, as you would say, got it.
Beautiful.
It became them, they became it.
Yes, totally entrained.
Yeah.
And was this the main center point of Atlantean education?
Well, there were several, but it was done in the main capital quite often, and there were several temples in which this was done, or systems or places of education.
Great. And Atlantis of being the legend of a worldwide
Oh,
initiatic.
wait, we have one word for you. Because their actual ancient name was Aztlan.
Aztlan. That's right.
Aztlan.
Aztlan.
Aztlan. Aztlan.
Ah, with the T.
Yes,
Aztlan.
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 Yes.
So an Aztlan. Just went in a hypnotic journey real quick. 1 second.
Yes.
Okay, so the idea of it, Aztlan being a worldwide initiatic culture?
Well, many, many people from around the world went there for educational purposes, and they did extend some of that to different parts of the world. But it wasn't global quite in the way that you're global now. They did have certain centers in different parts of the planet, but it wasn't as extensive as your technology allows it to be now.
Gotcha. And the idea of the mysteries and the idea of initiation and becoming more of yourself, all these ideas, even through Atlantean times, are just permission slips to get people in touch with more parts of themselves.
Of course.
So like the idea in many esoteric and magical traditions, they're all fighting over permission slips and saying who has the right permission slip.
Yes.
But the idea, if you understand the core construct of the science of the obvious and the initiation and the awakening of the self,
Yes.
then it becomes evident and obvious.
Yes, that's
Yes.
why we give you the simple structural formula. so that you don't have to necessarily compound it with things that you don't necessarily need, unless you believe you do. That's your choice. Then it comes down to a choice, as opposed to something you think has to be done in order for you to really have a deep understanding.
Yes.
Does that help?
Yes, and so then the alignment of the different energy bodies and physical body, the mental body, so to speak, Humpty Dumpty breaking apart and coming back together again, was that the same theme that the Atlanteans were going through, that we are going through as well?
Exactly.
Okay. So that's one thing that I'm highest excitement about is the hypnosis journey and merging people's consciousness so they're not just stuck on the mental plane,
Yes.
but so when they're thinking, they're actually re-engaging their thinking with vibration and feeling and
Yes.
thought and artistry and vision.
Yes.
So they're not just dry mental constructs talking.
Yes.
Okay.
Because a dry mental construct will never really get you that deep.
Yes. And that's why you can only take people as deep as you have been.
Well, yes, although some people can go deeper with much less incentive if they're already prepared for it than even sometimes the teacher. It just depends on the person. But you might trigger them to go deeper than you have been. It's possible.
Wonderful. And as far as like the story, you've talked about the Bible being the stories of Atlantis.
Well, some of it, yes.
Some of them.
Not all of it.
And some that were maybe the Nag Hammadi that was taken out, the Gnostic scriptures. Can you?
Well, there are many, many different kinds of scriptures and gospels that were never put into what you call your official Bible. You know that.
Yes. And the idea of Enoch becoming Metatron, was that the idea of one of the Anunnaki ascending into higher spiritual initiations?
Sort of. We're not going to go into detail on that story at the moment, but you're sort of in the right neighborhood, but there are details that are missing.
Okay, and as far as the Melchizedek energies,
yes,
how I know, we've talked about this a lot with Tote and everything.
Yes.
And how have you experienced, I've experienced Tote in different ways. How have you experienced Tote in different ways?
I have had tea with Tote.
You have had tea with Tote.
I am using a euphemism. That's all you're going to get right now.
What do you think about the serpent?
Does that make me a teetotaler?
A teetotaler? Okay. What do you tell me about the bane of the serpent? We've talked about the serpent a lot, but
we did. But I already told you that's all you're going to get right now.
Well, as far as like
that's
overcoming
all
fear,
you're going to get right now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mike.
Well, you're very welcome.
Always appreciating you.
And us as well to you.
Hello, Tadeo.
Nania.
Well, I just got a tsunami of questions on Atlantis.
How topical.
Okay, so let me ask a few of those questions.
Yes.
Most of what we know of Atlantis comes from the Casey material. Can you talk about the migration to Egypt and the pyramid prophecies, which end in 2038? Well, how are they so precise?
Again, they understood cycles of time in Atlantis very precisely. They understood how things play out, but do understand they were also only talking about certain probabilities and the probability of those probable realities coming into manifestation. So there is a little bit of a window there, not just precisely the idea of that year of 2038. But they're looking at the idea of cycles, and sometime around that time, there is another probability of another body, asteroidal, cometary in nature, that has a probability of impacting the Earth in and around that time. That's what the cycle is talking about. The cycles of impacts upon the Earth. That is, shall we say, frozen in the stone of what they built, that was there for you to interpret so that you would understand these cycles as well, and in a sense put yourself in a state where you would be able to change and shift the reality so that you would not necessarily have to go through what they went through.
Okay, and then the next one is the crystal technology that they used.
Yes.
Can you talk about the firestone that was accidentally tuned too high and contributed to the destruction of Atlantis?
Well, that's kind of an exaggeration or a lumping together of different incidents. It wasn't one thing that happened one day, that happened on the day that Atlantis was destroyed. But there were destructions that took place. There were things that got out of hand, got out of control with the idea of these manufactured crystals that had the capacity to store energy of the sun, to build up like a capacitor and release it all at once, very abruptly, very powerfully. So some of those experiments got a little out of hand, but they were the result of hubris. And that hubris in the vibration is what brought Atlantis down ultimately. It wasn't so much directly the idea of the Firestone crystals, but the idea of the hubris behind creating them.
So, speak of the hubris. What is?
Well, I think many of you are steeped in a society that is full of individuals expressing hubris at this point. Are you not? Arrogance.
Keep coming. Just to get the full feeling of what hubris is. That's it, arrogance.
Well, it's sort of the CIA formula we've given you before. C equals I plus A. Cynicism equals ignorance plus arrogance.
Right, because you did mention that cynicism is one of our more destructive.
Yes. It is what can bring you down. Cynicism. The idea of detaching yourself from the understanding of true connection and falling under, falling under
A spell.
the illusion of power instead of the power of the illusion. Yes, really.
So cynicism might be the idea of like people aren't.
Cynicism is thinking you know the answer before you know anything at all.
Is it also sort of anticipating the worst in others?
Not exactly the same thing. No.
Like not an assumption that people will
That's
always do the.
Pessimism.
That's pessimism.
Yes.
Okay. So
Cynicism is the idea that you know best no matter what the evidence may say.
So not being willing to temper your perceptions.
Correct.
Based on additional
Not
information.
being open to other points of view or even considering that they may have any validity to them other than your own.
And so it was that type of energy that brought down Atlantis?
That type of hubris created the division between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And again, there are certain parallels going on in America now.
Yeah, in fact, there's a question here. Let's see.
Which may or may not get an answer, depending upon how specific it might be.
Well, it says, I guess that the coming of the comet and the following destruction of Atlantis was no coincidence, obviously.
Obviously.
And could you speak about the preceding imbalances that finally caused the fall of Atlantis? Is that what we
That's
were
what
just
we're
talking about?
Yes.
Okay. And
They put themselves in a vibrational reality that was smack in the path of the comet, where there are many other realities where that was not so. But that particular reality and what you are considering your past, because of the connection you've made to the idea of the cyclic nature of coming around again, which to some degree we're going to be talking about in the Angels of Orion transmission, is the idea of connecting to those cycles of destruction and rising and falling, rising and falling, and rising and falling, and starting to learn how to break that chain.
so essentially, we here on Earth at this point, in this reality, are the beings that chose the trajectory that led to the fall of Atlantis, and now we're back making a new choice or attempting to make a new choice?
Because that's the most powerful. You remember the rubber band analogy.
Yes.
The farther you pull back into darkness, when you finally let go, you'll fly that much faster and farther into the light. So you're using energy to connect to some very deep, dark, negative experiences so that when you finally get a handle on these vibrations, you will propel yourself into the light that much more powerfully. You're using it as a catapult.
That also means that there was another Atlantis that didn't undergo the
Oh,
destruction.
absolutely. There are many versions of Earth where Atlantis thrived. Absolutely.
That's so interesting. So
I've visited one of them.
do
It's
tell.
profoundly beautiful in ways that you may not even be able to imagine at this point.
Wow. So that's really interesting. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about the whole idea of the same beings that experienced the negative trajectory in Atlantis are now focused on this particular transitional time.
Nope. We'll talk about that again in the transmission called The Angels of Orion.
And did they like take animals and people and like make things?
They understood genetics in a very, very similar way, but had different kinds of capacities to create certain kinds of hybrids that are also the basis of some of your mythological legends of certain kinds of creatures, yes.
Would we find that offensive now, what they were doing?
You would find it the product of incredible cynicism and hubris. It's not that you cannot explore genetics. You can. But remember, it's not about what it is. It's about how you use it. Because they used it to create a race of slaves.
And that doesn't go well, does it?
Not usually.
Okay, so
Remember, your greatest power is the freedom to choose. The greatest prison is taking that freedom away.
from another?
Yes. Slaves.
Ah.
Freedom to choose has been removed. That's what makes a slave.
So those that perpetrate that.
Are themselves enslaved, but they think they're not. And as we have often said, just again to use your terminology, the greatest hell is the one you don't even know you're in,
Wow.
because you can never escape it, because you don't know you're there. Those that are slavers are themselves enslaved. Those that are prison guards are themselves incapable of leaving the prison. Now, again, it depends on how these things are done. But nevertheless, on a basic principle, you cannot interact with something without in some way becoming a mirror of that thing. So it depends on how you use it, how you understand that reflection, that determines what you will experience in your reality, positive or negative. Because everything is a reflection, and that means you are also a reflection of everything.
It's a lot to process.
If you say so.
This last question is about maybe we've already discussed it. We'll see. Currently, Bahamas is going through catastrophic challenges.
Yes.
Does it imply any mirroring effect of the fall of Atlantis?
It does. And so does the Bermuda Triangle phenomenon.
Yes, in fact, one question came in about whether that impacts hurricanes on the East
does.
Coast.
But we won't go into the
oh.
actual science of it at this particular point.
Yeah,
But it does.
They were asking, was Bermuda part of Atlantis, and was the triangle, part of it?
The triangle didn't exist then in the way that it exists now. You could say that at this point it's sort of running amok, but it is representative of an energy that they tapped into and got out of hand, again, going back to that understanding, and was one of the reasons for the physiological vibrational attraction of the comet. See what we're saying?
Seems like a combination of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and was that hubris also?
Yes. So, using the same analogy, it's time to sweep the area clean.